You're in the water loop.
Water loop, water loop, water loop.
Hey, this is Travis with Waterloop. I want to tell you a story about High Sierra Showerheads, who I'm proud to have as a sponsor of this podcast, particularly because they make incredibly water-efficient showerheads. I've talked with owner David Malcolm about growing up in California, learning about the importance of water and energy efficiency from his father. David has been designing high-efficiency nozzles for agriculture and golf courses for the past 30 years. The golf course people actually came to him wanting a nozzle that produced a uniform spray but was water efficient. So David went in and designed a nozzle that explodes a low pressure stream of water into a shower of large, powerful droplets. David actually thought this would make a great showerhead, and that's how High Sierra Showerheads was born. And nobody has their nozzle technology. It's patented, and you get a great shower while saving water. Use promo code WATERLOOP for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
Water loop, water loop, water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Hurricanes. We heard a lot about them this year. It was an incredibly busy season in the Atlantic. I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Rick Lutic. He is the director of the Institute of Marine Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, it sure was a busy season, right? We got into the Greek alphabet with storms and just saw incredible activity. I think it was a record where there was a certain number where they're going at the same time in the Atlantic. You all were busy looking at that.
It's been a historic season, and it hasn't given up yet. We've got New Orleans is looking at a substantial storm coming at it at the end of the week. So yes, it has been a historic season for sure.
That's right. I forgot I saw that as well. I feel we're both in North Carolina. We're on the Carolina coast. I'm here in Wilmington. You're up in Morehead City. I kind of feel like, okay, when you get to October, we're generally safe here in the Carolina coast. I know it's hurricane season, but the ocean's cooling a little bit. Is that premature on my part?
Well, it certainly is. For example, Hurricane Sandy came through towards the end of October, and that was clearly a major event. I know I told my daughter when she wanted to get married that it was fine to get married here in coastal North Carolina for 10 months of the year, just not between the middle of August and the middle of October. So you're right. As we get into October, we think these things will wane, and historically they do, because the ocean just starts to cool down a little bit, and the fuel for these storms starts to go away.
Yeah. So you do a tremendous amount to study hurricanes, and I'm really curious to hear more about the role that climate change is playing in hurricanes, in their frequency, in their intensity, and just kind of what the science is behind that knowledge. We hear that pretty often. Of course, there's a lot of deniers out there. I don't even like to say skeptics, really. There's a lot of deniers. So I'm curious how we know that climate change is part of the equation.
Yeah. Well, we know a lot about hurricanes and how they operate. And one of the things that we know is that they get their energy from the ocean, from the warm waters of the ocean. And so anything that leads to a warming of the surface of the ocean is just simply adding fuel to the potential for storms. And so that's one of the primary signatures we see of climate change, is warming of the surface of the ocean. And we can measure that from satellites. We can measure that from ships. We have, very good data on what the surface of the ocean temperature looks like. So you're providing more fuel for these storms. Now, that has some subtleties to it. One is it just simply makes it easier for the storms to get stronger than they normally would. And so the science is telling us that it looks like today we're seeing stronger storms than we saw a few decades ago, and in the future we'll continue to see storms strengthening. Another thing it tells us is that storms can be strong further north than they normally would have, and in fact the Genesis region, that where there's enough energy, there's enough stuff going on that they can even get started, is starting to move north a bit. And so for the Gulf of Mexico, they're worried just because the storms are stronger. But as you start to work your way up the East Coast, then I think there's concern that strong storms now have the ability to penetrate further north and impact a larger section of the coast of the U.S. And of course, North Carolina is kind of in that intermediate area where it's not getting what necessarily Florida and the Gulf states might be getting, but it certainly is in an area that's within Hurricane Alley. And so if storms are stronger as they get further north, then North Carolina can expect to see more stronger storms in the future. Another thing that climate change is doing is it's warming the atmosphere, and a warmer atmosphere can hold more water. And so that means the storms are getting wetter. And so now we're not just how strong the wind is and maybe how much storm surge they generate, but now it's how much rainfall they may have associated with them. And so we're seeing, again, strong evidence that we're getting wetter and wetter storms. And so we're worried about the storm surge from the ocean, but now we're seeing storms that are dumping more precipitation in coastal areas and inland for that matter, and therefore having kind of a twofold, a double whammy, if you will, from both the ocean and from the precipitation. Another thing that climate change does is that it's definitely causing sea level to rise. And so now, whereas in the past, a storm surge of a certain amount may not have reached the top of the dunes, it may not have reached the first row of homes, it may not have reached your particular residence close to the ocean. With a rising sea level, the water is just simply starting off higher. And so that same amount of storm surge now is closer and closer to downtown streets, to homes, to infrastructure, and as a result, even the same storm now can do more damage than it would have in the past, just due to sea level rise. So all of these things are conspiring to make these storms more dangerous, more hazardous as the climate is warming.
That's what I was going to say. You have this kind of triple whammy, I guess, going on where the storms are stronger, they can carry more precipitation, and then you've got the sea level rise, so that storm surge can be more devastating, if you will. It's incredible. And so you were saying that the area where they generate, off the coast of Africa there, because of the warmer waters, they're able to even generate further north, or even as they're working across the Atlantic, they can stay viable and strong and hit more northern states like Virginia or Maryland in the future, presumably.
Exactly. And so Florence was a good example of that. Florence actually started fairly far north. And of course, living in eastern North Carolina, we felt, we took the brunt of Florence, but it was a storm that largely made an east to west track, but it made that track fairly far north. It was north of the Bahamas, for example, instead of down closer to the equator and coming across through the Caribbean and then making the curve up along the Caribbean islands. This storm was fairly far to the north, and it came due east or due west for the most part, northwest a bit, but straight at us. So good example of a storm that formed further north than tradition. And in fact, I think Florence set a record for being the strongest storm as far north as it was when it was out to sea. Now, fortunately, it diminished as it approached land, so that was good for us. But while it was out to sea, it was a very strong storm, and further north than we have historically seen those storms.
Well, and that was one of the ones that dumped a ton of precipitation. It kind of stalled out, and so it rained here in Wilmington for days.
For days.
Yeah.
Morehead City, not quite as bad, but we certainly felt the pain. Yeah.
And the rainfall with Harvey in the Houston area was incredible as well. Just record-setting rainfalls, as far as I'm aware. Incredible. One of the things you really specialize in is storm surge. For folks that might not know as much about storm surge, and even for my education, could you explain a little bit more about what storm surge is?
Sure. Storm surge, somewhat simply, is the change in water level due mostly to the winds that occurs that accompanies a storm. And so those that live along the coast are used to going to the beach and seeing the tides be high or low, seeing waves come in and break along the shore, and those are kind of normal things. When a storm comes along, and this can be a strong winter storm as well as a hurricane, it blows water either directly out in front of it or off to the right-hand side in the northern hemisphere, and that water then has to go somewhere, and it piles up against the shore. It piles up against the coast, against the dunes, but it also finds its way into the estuaries and the rivers. And in those cases, it can get funneled, so it can start in a wide area, but as it moves inland, it gets constricted. And in all cases, as the water gets pushed on the shore or towards the shore, it really doesn't have anywhere to go other than up and over the land. And so storm surge really, for the most part, is just that impact, the effects of those strong winds blowing on the water and blowing it against the shore, onto the shore, and into the shoreline features of our estuarine systems.
What's been some of the most damaging storm surge that people might have heard of the past bunch of years with these storms? I mean, was Sandy one that really had big storm surge, or?
Well, I think these storms are probably generational in terms of their how they show up in the public knowledge, and certainly those that are old enough know the storms that hit the Wilmington area, Cape Fear area, Hazel back in the late 50s. That's a kind of a seminal storm of record. Definitely, again, from North Carolina, Floyd and Fran in the late 90s were major impact storms, and more recently, certainly Florence in our memory is, and some of the other ones, Matthew as well. When you go more on a national scale, I think the one that really was transformational was certainly Katrina in New Orleans, and the impacts that really had on just simply the public recognition of what these storms can bring, and just a whole variety of social issues as well as engineering issues and coastal hazard issues. Katrina was just seminal in that regard. And then Sandy, certainly, because it hit such a major metropolitan area of the greater New York City area and the impacts that it had there. All of these are clearly seminal storms, and with a bit of sort of regional emphasis, and these are the kind of the ones that certainly our generation thinks about as you think about these events. And Harvey as well. I think Harvey was quite, and of course, if you live in Puerto Rico, you really think a lot about Maria.
Right.
And so each of these areas have had amazing events, really, in not that distant past.
You study storm surge, as I mentioned. What areas of the East Coast or in the Gulf of Mexico are most vulnerable to storm surge? Are there certain pockets or certain areas that are really vulnerable, and if so, why?
Well, so a couple of things. Of course, in order to have storm surge, you got to have storms. So the areas that see the greatest number of storms are obviously the ones that have to worry a lot about storm surge. And the Texas coast, the Louisiana coast, the Florida coast in the Gulf, and then really the coast of North Carolina along the Atlantic coast are the ones that historically have seen the most storms. So those are the ones that that worry about this perhaps the most. Storm surge is greatest when the water is shallow. And so essentially you can think about it as it's easier to pick up shallow water than it is deep water. So for example, around the Hawaiian Islands or even some of the Caribbean islands that are relic volcanoes and things, steep sides, and so the exact same storm coming through those areas will have less storm surge than it will in a shallow area like the Gulf Coast and areas of the East Coast of the United States. And so those areas become susceptible to storm surge. Areas that have estuaries that sort of project inland and that are funnel shaped, the Cape Fear River qualifies in that regard, but also, say, the Neuse River and the Tar River in North Carolina, and a variety of river estuarine systems, again, that are kind of funnel shaped, allow the water to come in the mouth, and then as it propagates upstream, it gets squeezed down laterally, and so it has to go up vertically. And then
I was going to say, I used to live in Annapolis, Maryland, and I know people were always worried about hurricanes and their impacts in the Chesapeake Bay, just kind of pushing up and having that exact effect.
Exactly, and I think it was Isabel that had a fairly major effect up in the upper part of the Chesapeake Bay for exactly that reason. Yep. And then the other part of storm surge that makes it so problematic are areas that simply where the land is very close to the ocean level, and so that have low relief. And again, eastern North Carolina, particularly the northern half of the state of North Carolina, and around the sounds, around Pamlico Sound and Albemarle Sound, the lands in those areas are very low, very flat. And so it doesn't take much storm surge to go from the water being in the traditional water bodies to where it's up on the land and flooding the areas and the people that live there. So, and a lot of the Gulf Coast is similarly flat, and a lot of the southeastern United States and Gulf coasts are flat, low topography, and so all of those areas are the areas. So you kind of again have the triple whammy of shallow coastal waters, susceptibility of the storms being there, and then low relief topography, making it fairly easy for the water to propagate up onto land.
And I always think about those Outer Banks. They're barrier islands, so they are ever shifting and moving anyway, and they're so narrow and low lying and just sticking out there like a bullseye. I always wonder about their future, with sea level rise also. It's like, ooh.
I think we all do. I mean, the day will come when it's hard to continue to just get bulldozers out there and rebuild Highway 12 and continue to try to pile the sand into dunes and hold on to that area, and it won't all go at once, but there are certainly lower and higher spots along them, and the lower spots, boy, when Hurricane Dorian came through last year, something between 58 and 70 some odd inlets were formed along core banks, overwash areas, where the water actually penetrated between the sound and the ocean.
Wow.
And many of those have filled back in, but that's just an example of how low-lying those areas are and how easier and easier it is for those areas to become overwashed. And again, now, core banks is natural, and it's not inhabited other than some fishing camps and things, which were substantially impacted. But in the areas that are not as engineered and not as put back, if you will, you're just simply seeing the evidence of that occurring. And so now go further north to Hatteras and Ocracoke and those islands, and it simply will be harder and harder to continue to maintain them into the future.
Yeah, at some point there's policy and community decisions about how much and how long you're going to fight nature and do that. Speaking of which, one of the other things, in studying storm surge, there's a lot of science that goes on. I think there's a lot of modeling that goes on, and I'm really curious about that field of work and what's happening in that area, and then how can that be used to help communities make decisions about resiliency and so forth.
Well, that's the exact area that I work in, and so for much of my career here at UNC, I've been working with other colleagues around the United States in particular to develop better models that predict how the coastal ocean waters move. And in particular, we have really advanced the modeling to predict how the coastal ocean waters moved when severe storms come through, like hurricanes. And so, as we talked about earlier, that is what causes storm surge. And so our modeling activities try to get better representations of coastal areas. And again, if you live along most coastal areas, but North Carolina in particular, you look at it and you see how geometrically complex it is. and so a lot of the challenges is how do you get your models to faithfully represent the complexity of the layout of the shoreline, but also of the topography, because high areas block storm surge, low areas allow it to propagate. And so if you really want to find out what areas it's going to go into, who's going to get flooded and under what conditions, you have to represent and accurately represent that complexity. And so that's really a lot of the work that we've been doing here at UNC, and again in my lab, is to try to advance our ability to use computer models to represent those. Those computer models get used, and in particular the one that I've worked on for a couple of decades now, get used for a variety of purposes. The one purpose that they get used for is to try to help define what the hazard level is in any coastal area. So what is, say, in any given year, what if there's a 1% chance of getting flooded, what does that look like? What areas would be flooded? How deep would it be? And things like that. So at various sorts of hazard levels, probabilities, if you will, and sometimes we convert that into return periods. So sometimes we call the 1% chance the 100-year event. Right. And so we just flip it upside down. It can be a little bit misleading because it implies if you have one this year, you've got another 99 years before it's going to happen again. And it doesn't work that way. So it's in any given year, it's a 1% chance of happening. So, but the point is, and you can define, what's the percentage of it happening, a 5% chance of happening in any given year, or various other levels. But again, the 1% chance is kind of the benchmark that we use for a lot of decision making. Well, somebody has to draw the maps that lay out what that is and what those conditions look like, how deep it's going to be. Well, the computer models that I've developed are what FEMA uses to do that, to delineate that, and they've used them from New York all the way around to Texas. And so that's one application of our computer models. Another application is for design. You say, okay, the probability is this is what we've got, what we're going to face. What do we do about it? And so designers then say, well, if we build a levee or if we build a flood wall, how high would it have to be in order to protect us? And if we build a flood wall here, what might be the consequences somewhere else of holding the water back here and letting it flow to other places? So again, the computer models that we've developed are used extensively by the Army Corps of Engineers and a number of consulting companies for those types of calculations. If you go to New Orleans, the entire levee system and flood wall system, the protection system around New Orleans was designed using our computer model.
That's awesome.
You go to Houston Galveston, and they are still trying to figure out what to do to better protect that area. And they've got various options that they're looking at, and those are being evaluated again with our model. After Hurricane Sandy, a lot of work was done in the greater New York area, and again, largely done design options looked at with our model. And then another thing that we do with our model is when an event is imminent, and right now Hurricane Delta looks like it's imminent in the greater New Orleans, southern Louisiana area. We will run our model in real time to try to give our best prediction of what is likely to happen in the storm surge arena. How high is it going to get, what areas are going to flood, what the implications might be in advance of the storm. So we're doing that right now, again, for Hurricane Delta along the northern Gulf Coast.
Oh, that's great to hear all the applications for that. I think, though, often about the more mid-size or smaller communities along the coast. And are they really looking at this type of information and then making decisions or setting policy accordingly? I mean, I just see people continuing to flock to the coast and developing on the coast and as close to the water as you can get. That's where everybody wants to be. And so it's an interesting dilemma, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, I live in a coastal county. You live in a coastal county. It's a wonderful place to live.
Absolutely.
If you look at population growth rates, coastal counties along the U.S. coastal counties are growing in fact, in the southeast, along the southeast Atlantic and Gulf, are growing at twice the national population growth rates. People want to live there. Some of the best, highest land was developed first. And so the more people come, the more housing they need. What's left over is oftentimes the area that are at higher risk. And then there needs to be wise decisions made in terms of what areas should or shouldn't be developed and under what circumstances. And of course, for coastal counties, development means property tax revenue, which means better services, and including schools and other civic services. So it can be a real conundrum how to draw the line and when to draw the line, and how to manage these areas. A lot of pressures. Sure.
Little bit of a side question. Sea level rise is a big factor. Land subsidence. I know. I saw an article recently about the Norfolk area in Virginia. How they're on the forefront of sea level rise, but they also have a land subsidence issue. Is that happening along the lower part of the East Coast, land subsidence, and does that factor into this equation at all?
It does, and so again, to come back to kind of the Gulf Coast with all of the oil extraction that's gone on there, and also groundwater extraction, and groundwater has been taken out, one, to simply drain some of the marshy, swampy areas for public health reasons, but also for industrial purposes. Both of those have led to substantial subsidence in those areas. Some of the highest subsidence rates in the United States are in southern Louisiana. And so that's a really big deal. Other areas are subsiding more just based on natural tectonic processes, natural earth. Even dating back to things like the Earth's rebound from when there were glaciers covered these areas. That plays a role in it. Along the East Coast, in fact, in the state of North Carolina, what you find is the northern part of the state is subsiding a little bit more rapidly than the southern part of the state. And so that has to be taken account when you think about and figure sea level rise, because it's relative sea level rise is what we care about. It's how the sea level is rising compared to the land. So even if the sea level was staying flat, if we were subsiding, we would be having relative sea level rise. And so that's been an issue. It will remain an issue in some of the worst, the areas of worst subsidence. What you're starting to see is as sea level rise begins to accelerate, so sea level is not just rising at a constant rate every year for decades and decades and decades. It has been slow. It's getting a little faster. And what the climate models are really telling us, and we're starting to see the beginning parts of this, is that as we get out to about the middle of the 21st century, then it's going to start rising even faster and faster. As that starts to happen, and that's due to melting of glaciers in particular, but as that starts to happen, the subsidence part of the equation starts to become smaller and smaller in the overall impact. So it has been an issue thus far, even in places like North Carolina and as you mentioned, up into Virginia. As time goes on, its contribution to relative sea level rise and the threat that people have to deal with will become smaller as some of these other effects become larger.
Well, it seems like a state like Florida also is so incredibly vulnerable with how flat they are, basically, and a peninsula, yep. And they've got sea level rise and right in that hurricane path, and incredible. Yes. I wanted to talk a little bit about what UNC does to study hurricanes, really not in real time, if you will, right? When they're approaching the Carolina coast, after they've hit the Carolina coast, what kind of science you all do and how that's helpful?
Sure. Well, again, my own research involves trying to predict them in advance as they're approaching, and then validation of how well we did, and then that in turn feeds into improving the models, and then hopefully those models have uses not only for future individual storms, but again, for future evaluation of risk and hazards. That's my particular work area. There are others here at UNC that have for years studied what hurricanes do to the water quality that we have in eastern North Carolina. And what you see, particularly with the storms that have a big rainfall associated with them, and this dates back into the 90s of Hurricane Floyd in particular, but some of the more recent ones, Dorian and Matthew, they have an enormous flush of the land, and so an awful lot of organic material, leaves and other things, as well as less desirable man-made wastes of various sorts, flow across the land and into the coastal waters, and they can have an enormous impact on the livability of the coastal waters. And we definitely see that in some of the northern estuaries, in the Neuse River estuary, in the Tar-Pamlico estuary that are part of Pamlico Sound and up into Albemarle Sound. The organic load will come into those areas, be consumed by bacteria, and that depletes all of the oxygen. So those waters become what we call dead zones. They become almost entirely depleted of oxygen, and anything that might be living there doesn't have much of a chance. It either has to move or it dies. And so we have done a lot of research over the years into the causes of that, the occurrences of that, and the consequences of that in terms of water quality.
You also, I was going to add, some of that man-made stuff that you mentioned. You've got coal ash ponds in eastern North Carolina. You've got all the hog farms, and so you get a lot of really undesirable stuff that ends up in the coastal waters. I mean, I'm a surfer, and so I know that after those storms, got to hang tight often. With Florence, it was not good to get in that water for quite some time until all that stuff worked its way down the rivers and out to sea. Yeah. Yeah,
and you can see plumes of it from satellite imagery that are clear as a bell coming out the inlet mouths and the river mouths out into the coastal ocean. It tends to be a very brown water. Not necessarily, the brown isn't necessarily pollution. It's just tannic acid from the land, but it's a visual indication of where that water is and where it's going, and any of the pollution that is in it. And I don't know to the extent that we have coal ash in eastern North Carolina. We might, but I know that we certainly have hog lagoons and other industrial poultry farms and things that have historically run into the water, and just simply runoff from fields and things can be problematic in terms of what it brings with it as well. So all of that does impact our estuaries first, and then it does make its way offshore. And again, it takes weeks to months to kind of fully flush that out of the system. And then it takes time after that for the systems to kind of recover and get back into a more normal life cycle. And so that they're functioning in the way that we like our healthy ecosystems to function.
Not as important, but those storms blow out the sandbars too. So as a surfer, again, I'm like, I got to wait for nature to do its thing and rebuild those sandbars for me.
Well, and a lot of that happens in the fair weather months of the summer. So if you so it may be a year or so before some of that starts to come again.
Yeah.
Other areas that we do research is how to better protect the shorelines, in particular, from just erosion. I mean, and just a little bit lesser extent how we might mitigate flooding, but particularly shoreline erosion. What sorts of things can we do to keep that from happening in the face of these storms? Of course, the go-to solution for decades now has been to build bulkheads and hard structures. Those are expensive and they tend to be hard to maintain. They're not self-healing, that's for sure, when a storm event comes through. And so what we've been trying to look at is whether there are better solutions than that maybe take advantage of nature, take advantage of living shorelines to where we can try to get marshes recreated in areas that help protect from erosion. To what extent can we use things like oysters? Oysters are pretty amazing organisms. They clean the water. They have a hard structure to them. Which may help protect the shoreline. They sequester carbon, which is a good thing from a climate change perspective. And by the way, they can be pretty tasty to eat. And so work being done in those areas of how to simply work in hand with nature on things that are if you can get them started or recreated or give them a helping hand, then they'll kind of do some of the work for you and you get additional services out of them as you go.
Yeah, I've seen a number of articles recently about artificial concrete reefs and these kind of structures that are being explored as possibilities to put close to the shore, maybe a little offshore to kind of maybe break up the wave action or something like that. I saw stories maybe out of the University of Miami. I just saw one in a Connecticut community, I think, where they're exploring with some of these things that aren't hardening the actual shoreline, but kind of putting some stuff offshore.
Yeah, a variety of engineering solutions of that sort, and it makes sense. Waves break. If you're a surfer, waves break when the water gets shallower, and so if you can essentially trip the waves and get them to break further offshore, then they dissipate their energy further from the shoreline. So those are, there's a variety of strategies of one sort or another that have been pursued and continue to be pursued. That I think hold promise in certain areas. It has something to do with the cross shore profile, and if you can't go too far offshore and put them too deep, or otherwise you simply don't get the effect that you're looking for. So in certain areas, I think that they're viable, and what they try to avoid is putting things that are right against the shoreline that are hardened, because then water just simply wants to erode around those. And actually it tends to cause the shorelines to erode more quickly than they would have otherwise in some cases. And what you really want to try to do is try to avoid putting things that are perpendicular to the shoreline that start to stop the natural transport of sediment and sand along the shoreline. Those are things that become more and more challenging to maintain, and they have more significant consequences, particularly on the downdrift side. So they've been used throughout time, and we continue to look at them, particularly for stabilizing inlets these days. But the more we can get away from disrupting the longshore transport of sediment, the better, the more we're working within our natural system.
Yeah. I guess I should have asked this question toward the beginning, but it's kind of the last one I have is 2020. It's a crazy year anyway. It was for the hurricane season. Was this an anomaly, or is this a a precursor of things to come as far as the amount of activity that we see in the Atlantic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a historical anomaly for sure, at least in sort of our recorded time period. This is up there of the most active year we've ever had, if not at this point, the absolute most active year. The year that Katrina came through, we got into the Greek letters as well, and so, but in certainly the times that most people have been alive for, those are the 2 years from a total activity perspective. But I think we have to expect this to occur more in the future. Again, the surface of the ocean, the energy for these storms is increasing with climate change. It's getting warmer. We see that. The atmosphere is getting warmer. We simply are seeing that consistently in the data, and so the energy for these storms is ever increasing. Now, what you typically see, why is it? Why, if that's the case, why don't we see 20 or 30 storms every year? Well, the large-scale meteorological conditions have to be favorable for these storms to actually form. They can start, but unless the conditions are favorable, they won't actually persist. They won't actually get far enough along to where they can then self-sustain themselves. Those are large-scale, again, meteorological patterns. The single most significant aspect of determining those large-scale patterns is what we call the El Nino cycle, the El Nino-La Nina cycle, and that actually is largely in the Pacific Ocean. And so when that sets itself up in an El Nino type of situation, then you get winds that extend into the Atlantic basin, and those winds tend to tear the storms apart. They create what we call wind shear. And so those conditions are very unfavorable for storm formation. Doesn't mean they can't form at all, but it means that a lot of the storms that otherwise might form get essentially torn apart before they get going. When you get into the opposite situation of La Nina, or just simply a neutral condition or a La Nina condition, that's when these storms, fueled by the warm water, can get started and really start to go to town. And that's what we see this year. We see a neutral to slightly La Nina type scenario, and that's what has really conspired to bring us to this situation of having so many storms in the basin. And again, with a warm ocean, it's kind of rolling the dice. Every few years, we're going to get into a situation where we have less atmospheric conditions that are tearing these storms apart. So I think we've got to be prepared for it. And NOAA, the groups that look forward, particularly early in the calendar year, and make projections for hurricane season, saw this coming. They didn't see it being quite as significant as it was initially, but as we rolled into May timeframe, they really started to see, and so they were in the 25, 26 named storms at that point in terms of their predictions, and so pretty much right on. And so I don't think it was a surprise, and we know enough about these storms to know that this is probably the new normal.
Yeah. Well, let's hope at least for the rest of this fall that you and I here in North Carolina stay calm. It's been enough of a year this year, that's for sure. Dr. Ludick, I thank you so much for your time and the information. Really interesting stuff. So thanks a ton.
Sure, my pleasure. I enjoy talking to you.
Waterloop, Waterloop, Waterloop.
The Waterloop podcast is brought to you by High Sierra Showerheads, the smart and stylish way to save water, energy, and money while enjoying a powerful shower. Use promo code WATERLOOP for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
You're in the water loop.
Waterloop, Waterloop, Waterloop.